Well, it is good to be back with y'all. I have missed you in this past month, but I'm very grateful to our shepherds for letting me have a season to get away and read and study and prepare and pray, and I am excited about this coming year. Y'all, by the way, have had a great month. I mean, all the people who preached, it's been wonderful. There were 7 or 8 baptisms, and like half of those were adult conversions over this past month. Your worship minister, Josh Kaysner, I don't know if y'all know this, but he went to Nashville to teach a seminar on conflict resolution for other Church of Christ worship ministers. And while he was there, he led a Chick-fil-A revival. I don't know how many of y'all saw that on the, okay, look at that. 27 million people saw, I'm not making that up, that 27 million people saw Josh and a bunch of Church of Christ worship ministers lean on me in Chick-fil-A, so you've had a good month. I am beginning today my second year as your preaching minister here, and I got to tell you, I have loved getting to do this. Y'all, we're so grateful to get to be on staff here, to get to be a part of this church. Y'all have been really great to Leslie and I the past 12 months. Y'all helped me remodel the home that I grew up in. A lot of y'all in this room helped me do that. Jim Wood, Brother Jim, he helped a ton. Brother Ricky Biddle, I see him back there. Him and some other guys put can lights in our house, all through our house. And later on, me and Jim, we were putting attic flooring in. We put some attic flooring in because we needed some storage. And a couple of days later, I noticed that plywood that we had put down was pushing those can lights down like it was coming out of our ceiling. So I called Brother Jim and I was like, hey, Brother Jim, the can lights are sticking out a few inches from the ceiling. Who's going to tell Brother Ricky? And because he's like his brother-in-law, he goes, well, I'll do it. So I said, what are you going to say? Jim Wood goes, I'm going to remind him I'm an elder and then I'm going to turn off my hearing aid battery. I say all that to say, y'all have been so great to us this past 12 months. Y'all have been a real encouragement to me. And let me brag on y'all a little bit. You have done a great job stretching and growing and changing this year. You've accepted my family and the Kaysingers really well. And believe it or not, we've actually worked really hard not to change anything this first year. We wanted to get to know y'all and why we do what we do. And let me tell you this, y'all have changed my mind a couple of times. This past year, I've grown to realize how important reverence is, and I also realize how regular meeting and fellowship is so incredibly important. Y'all do that really, really well. But maybe you can't see it because you're so close. So let me just ask a question. If you've been a member here for 40 years, would you raise your hand? Okay, keep them up. If you've been a member here, keep them up. If you've been a member here for 30 years, would you raise your hand? If you've been a member here for 20 years, would you raise your hand? If you've been a member here for 10 years and 5 years. Okay, so there are quite a few new people, and there's also a lot of people who have been here for a while. And here's why this is important. If you've been here for a while, you don't know what a great thing you have. And so let me tell you, with somebody with fresh eyes coming in, one of the best things we do as a church is our fellowship together. My nephew, Gary, grew up going to First Baptist Benton, and he started coming here the past year. And the first month, we had a potluck. And afterwards, he goes, this is amazing. He was more excited about that potluck than he has been any sermon I've ever preached. And to be honest, I'm more excited about potlucks than any sermon we've got. Because, I mean this, our tribe, that's the best part of our DNA, is the fellowship we have. Because it's not just fellowship. You are not just shaking hands and kissing babies. It is the fellowship of the Holy Spirit that we gather together and do. We have a unity that outside of Jesus Christ is impossible to reproduce. And that's really important because these days, aren't you tired of all the ways our society divides us? I mean, we've been taught to think like individuals, right? But think about it. You've been taught to think of your preferences based on your skin color, based on your your educational level, based on your gender. You've been taught to think in terms of, we've divided society educationally, racially, intellectually, and generationally. And this is the great tragedy of modern American churches. I have said it before and I will say it many times. Church planners are told when you plan a church, you have to pick between being a church of over 40 or under 40? Is anybody else disturbed by that? That basically people can't give in their preferences so much, you have to pick between it. That's so disturbing to me because growing up in that little church I grew up in, I was the youth group. But those people taught me how to live and love and die. And I taught them how to program their VCRs. And so I want to know, PV, do we want to be a church that's intergenerational? And before you answer that question, let me explain to you what I'm really asking. Do you remember life before this? Before smartphones? Before we had smartphones, we had dumb phones. This is what is called a rotary phone. How many of you grew up using rotary phones? Okay, for those of you who do not know what this is, a rotary phone is slightly faster than a postcard. And basically what happens, instead of buttons, there's no buttons on this thing. You have to put your finger in one of the holes and spin the dial. If you had a friend, and like towards the end is like 9 and 0, if you had a friend with a lot of 9s or 0s, you stopped being their friend. Because it took a long time to call them. You had, phones back in the day. I remember when cordless phones became a huge thing. You know what a luxury item was before a cordless phone? A phone with a long cord. That way you could walk around. And guess what? Phones used to be stuck on the walls. There used to be, and this is going to, some of y'all, you've never seen this before. There used to be phones on the corners of streets and outside restaurants, and you used to have to pay how much? A dime. Yeah, you can tell the generational differences there. Yeah, quarter, dime, penny. Yeah. Yeah, you used to have payphones everywhere, but now we don't have that. You used to. Before your smartphone, if you wanted to know, or before Al Gore invented the internet, before that, if you wanted to know the news, you know what you had to do? You had to wait till a thing called a newspaper came out. And after you were done reading the news, that's all you got for the day. You had to wait for the next day for it to come out. If you wanted to know when movies were playing in the theater around you, you want to know what you had to do? Call them. And guess what? If somebody else was calling them at the same time, what did you get? You got a busy signal. There's an entire generation that has no idea what sentence I just said. A busy signal? What is that? Yeah, it's not just phones though, is it? How many of y'all remember these behemoths? This is from Mark and Kim Rickett. They gave it to me. It's one of those camcorders with VHS tapes. They gave it to me in a case that, I kid you not, we had to unlock with a key because we don't want anybody stealing this valuable piece of treasure, right? Do you remember when these first came out? I remember like my brother-in-law and sister, they had this and they would bring them to like Christmas and my like little kids' soccer games. And I remember watching Bert just slowly kind of lose his balance. There's an entire generation of people who have shoulder and back problems from carting these things around everywhere. And now it's all replaced with your smartphone, right? This generational change has happened. Neuroscientists have actually discovered that the pace of technological change is actually changing our brains. It's making us more impatient and emotionally unconnected. So our change is changing us. Now, to be clear, I love change. I eat change for breakfast until I don't. I like change that I like, but I'm not sure about the change you're trying to initiate. Sometimes we choose change, and sometimes change chooses us. But one constant in life is that things change. I think about a little girl who hides her head under the pillow at night so she won't have to hear her mommy and daddy yelling at each other. And then when they finally come and sit down with her and tell them that mommy and daddy aren't going to be married anymore, she hates change. I think about a man who's had a job for 40 years, and it brings him a sense of purpose. It brings him a sense of fulfillment. He loves being a part of something bigger than himself. And then one day they come to him and tell him that his services are no longer needed. Or maybe he has some kind of health crisis that makes it where it's impossible to work anymore. He hates change. This is a change-crazy, heartbreaking world. So what do? Where do you go? Maybe for you, that's happening right now. And if not, it might happen soon. And most of the change that's happening in the world happens from generation to generation. Let me just give you an example. Dalen Moore, who's this wonderful minister, just graduated from Harding. He's a 22-year-old, our spiritual formation minister. He shares an office with Courtney Herscheider. And the other day he came in and he looked at something on her desk and he goes, is that what they call a fax machine? Let me show you what Dalen thought was a fax machine. Nothing makes you feel old. And by the way, I've worked with college students for the last 16 years of my life. You constantly are having these kinds of conversations. We are shaped by our generation in ways that we are not aware of, right? The historical events that happened in your childhood shape your values and worldviews. When you were born colors almost everything. The era you were born in fills your head with ideas and emotions, what you should do with your emotions, how you should enter a conversation, what it means to be a man or a woman, how you should respond to others, how you should think about God and family and country. And here's where it gets difficult. Generational tensions, which are happening in every denomination across the country, really across the world, generational tensions are really difficult because most of the things that happen in a generation go without saying. They go without questioning. Core values of a generation go without questioning. And then the next generation comes along, and what do? They question it. So, for example, of course we put the cell phone down when you're having a conversation with someone. Of course we let the oldest generation determine the traditions for family get-togethers and Christmas. Of course we plan family reunions through emails. There's no way we're going to get on the phone with 12 different people. And if Aunt Deb won't get on the email, then she just doesn't get a say in what happens. See, every generation was raised with some big assumptions and life experiences that color the way they see everything. So, for example, you can't understand the greatest generation. How many greatest generation people do we have in the house? Nobody would. Thank you, Miss Bonnie. Yeah, there's more than Miss Bonnie in the greatest generation. But you can't understand the greatest generation without understanding the Great Depression. Friend of this church, one of my best friends and mentors, Randy Harris, he said he used to tell preaching students, before they went to a church, the most important question they needed to ask the eldership is, how many of you grew up in the Great Depression? Because it's important, because you will hear their cautiousness as a lack of faith, when what it really is they know the need to be thrifty. They saw that things can turn bad really quickly. The Great Depression colored everything for the greatest generation. Not just that, World War II. That taught them to sacrifice. World War II united the country like nothing before it. Families would gather around the radio and they would pray for the soldiers that were storming the beaches of Normandy. And those soldiers that were doing that were doing it in the face of almost certain death, but they knew that death was better than life under a world ruled by a dictator. So the greatest generation, they learned to sacrifice their individuality. They learned to sit down and shut up and do what they were told. They learned not to complain about things that they see younger people getting upset about, that are trivial. They ate cold ration meals in foxholes, and so it's kind of annoying for them to hear people complain about not enough kale in their salad, right? Because of World War II, the greatest generation witnessed the power of people coming together, of people making sacrifices for the greater good. But because of World War II, the greatest generation also noticed that there's something that happens when people blindly obey charismatic leaders. They noticed that there was a problem when people didn't question authority at home, and they went on to raise their kids to question authority. And that brings us to their kids, the generation known as the baby boomers. That's right. Now, in order to give you a handle on the baby boomers, the best way to describe it is after World War II was over, right before World War II was over, 2.7 million cases of baby food was sold. 5 years later, 15 million cases of baby food was sold. And that's because they were this huge generation. They dominated everything, the markets, the schools, hospitals, everything, including churches. Baby boomers were way less likely to be loyal to their home church, to a particular denomination. Instead, they would ask questions like, does this feed me? Because remember, the seeds for that was actually planted by greatest generation, their parents. Now, baby boomers had a great work ethic. They helped lead the country to its most prosperous season. They had huge expectations put on them, and they were also known as the me generation. And then baby boomers had kids. Gen Xers, or millennials. Gen Xers were the first kids to feel the shock waves of no-fault divorce when that came through. And all of a sudden, a whole generation is raised up knowing you can't depend on family, the nuclear family. And so for them, a huge value is friendship. So much so that the number one show for years was Friends. Because those are the people who will be there for you. Those are the people who will be loyal to you when you don't have a stable family life. And while older generations may roll their eyes at parents, spending $600 on car seats or, child-centered marriages or over-the-top birthday party extravaganzas, one of the things Gen Xers were doing was saying, no, family matters. Their focus on their family was an invaluable spiritual strength. And that brings us to millennials. One of the best ways to describe millennials to people who aren't millennials is millennials don't know what this is. A Polaroid camera. How many of you used Polaroid cameras in the past? All right, now, listen, I know millennials. I know you're saying, no, we have Polaroids. They've come back. Those instant cameras, they've come back. No. You don't know what this is like, because what you have as instant is actually closer to instant. This is anything but instant. So I've asked one of our millennials, Matthew, our visiting missionary, is going to take a picture. Who feels like doing some light modeling real quick? Anybody? Just one picture. That's all I need. Okay, Rachel, do you mind? Would you go to her and take a picture? And after you're done, you're going to have to, in the words of Outkast, shake it like a Polaroid picture. And then you're going to shake that. And let me know when it's done, okay, Matthew? Just raise your hand and tell me when it looks anything like the picture actually looks like of Rachel. Okay, you can go ahead and take that picture. Let me show you what happened when we took this in the office earlier this week. I just found this. We wanted to test it. This is Kelly Cumberledge. Thanks so much, Matthew. Okay, now shake it. You got to shake it. Okay, so the millennials are the most photographed generation in human history, right? Their birthday parties, their kindergarten celebrations felt like paparazzi were around them. They had trophies for everything, in large part because the generations before them didn't get trophies for anything, because it was this giant generation, right? You had to compete for everything. Millennials never had to learn computers. They were basically, kind of native to the digital age. In fact, so much so that some people say that, about half of millennials say they would rather lose their sense of smell than give up their smartphone. And sometimes they come across as entitled. They're more likely to live at home well into their 20s, but they also have a closer relationship to their parents than any generation before them. They're more likely to list a parent or a grandparent as a role model. They're committed to causes. They're confident. And churches have got to learn how to love and accept millennials. Think about it. It has not been easy growing up in the shadow of 9/11, especially when it comes to faith, because it was people of faith who flew those planes into those buildings. And so the way we talk about faith has got to consider that. They know that it doesn't matter how much organic kale they have on their salad, life is unpredictable and it could end at any moment. So they want to make a difference now. And churches have not been able to adapt to that. There was this one book called Got Religion where the author points out the reason millennials are leaving churches is because churches treat them like every other place in society. You cannot get involved in any meaningful role or responsibility or leadership until you're like 40. We've got to do better at that because the New Testament does different than that. Because the early Christians were different than that. Millennials are confident. Their parents and teachers convince them that they're special, and they believe it. 96% of millennials in a survey said, I can do something great. And in my experience, church, they're right. In my experience, millennials are passionate, cause-driven to sacrifice for something bigger than themselves. Now, you may be asking, what is the purpose of me telling you all that? It's because most of the problems that we're facing as a local church, that churches all over in all kinds of tribes all over the country are facing, are not what we say they're about. We have tricked ourselves. What they're really about is that for the first time in human history, churches are having to deal with how can you be 5 different generations together. And I'll tell you one solution. One solution is to plant a church that picks above 40 or below 40. But I think that grieves God and the Holy Spirit. I read this book over a study break called Generational IQ, and there's a very long quote, but I think it's worth reading to you. Here's where the author, Hayden Shaw, says it. So many of our fights are generational, even though we call them other things. Worship wars, attractional versus missional strategies, large churches versus small churches, verse by verse or topical teaching. Every one of them is defended with Scripture as the true approach, even though how we interpret the Bible regarding each of these issues depends on our generational lenses. We think we're arguing about other things when they are often generational. We have to figure out how we will handle 5 generations. For example, how do we reach the younger generations now that people are living 30 years longer and don't appreciate that we are no longer offering the worship styles they are used to? When people didn't live as long, churches would naturally adjust to each generation. But now that people attend churches for years longer, they usually prefer to keep things as they like them rather than adjusting to the preferences of the younger generations. And because they tend to be the biggest financial givers, they don't get as much pushback. So the younger generations leave. When people died younger, churches changed sooner. That sounds crass, but it's the reality. God blessed us with longer lives, but until we start having better conversations, that blessing may unintentionally cause churches to miss millions of people by the time they finally do change. Now, this is so important what he just said. Here's what he's not saying, what I'm not saying. I don't want to go to a church that's just full of young people. I don't want to go to a church without a Brother Dawson. I don't want to go to a church without a Miss Bonnie or a Brother Bob Hooper. I don't want to go to a church like that. But I also don't want to go to a church that can't pass the baton off to the next generation. One of the big reasons I came here to be your preacher is because a little over a year ago, as I was talking with your shepherds, one of your shepherds was Lewis Starling, who was well into his 90s. And he took me aside afterwards and said, Jonathan, I've lived for over 9 decades now. You can imagine the changes I've seen in church. And I can tell you, Pleasant Valley cares about this. We can do this. I think that's right. I think we can be a fellowship of the Holy Spirit and have the mind of Christ. And it's not just the people who are senior saints giving to the people who are younger. It goes both ways, and it's people in the middle. Let me tell you about what happened this week. This week was our oldest daughter, Eden's 11th birthday. And I always take the birthday kid out to lunch and ask them questions based on their age. So it was 11 questions for Eden. And one of those questions was, what in the past year, where have you grown or learned about, in your spiritual life with God and faith and Jesus and church? And then I just sat back and waited basically for her to tell me what her favorite sermon was from the past year. But it wasn't one of my sermons. What made the biggest impact on my daughter in the past 12 months was something she heard a couple of months ago from one of our children's ministry volunteers, Colin. Mr. Colin told this story, and it's this really powerful, profound story that to her just opened up a whole new way of thinking about God. And it made my heart swell with all kinds of pride as I'm hearing this from Eden, but not just for Eden, for Colin, for our children's ministry. Because, Leslie and I, we try to disciple our kids, but we can't do this alone. We know it's our first priority, but it doesn't just take a village, it takes a church. And so let me make a shameless plug. If you're here today and you're not involved, children's ministry is a great place to get plugged in. Our children's minister, Tina Brown, is a rock star. They set you up for success, but not just that. I can't tell you how many funerals I've done where people have told me over the funeral to say what an impact someone who taught them in Bible school was. How the course of the course of their life, the trajectory of their life was shaped by someone taking a small amount of time and giving it to help shape the faith and the future of the next generation. This is not just something for old people to do for young people or young people to do for old people. It's what it means to be the church. It means if you're an empty nester, you don't think, well, I've served my time. No, you haven't. Because your time, we're called, all 5 generations of us are called to pass the gospel off to the next generation. And this brings me back to Romans 14 and the passage Ben Beggs read. Paul's major point in Romans 14 is what we've been talking about today. Romans is written, actually, Jewish Christian, all the Jews in Rome had been kicked out by an edict of Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, in 49 AD. You can read about that in Acts 19. Every Jewish person gets kicked out of Rome, including Jewish Christians, which means the only Christians in Rome for 5 years were Gentile Christians. And 5 years later, Claudius lets everybody back in. So the Jewish people come back, and guess what they discover? That people had changed the way they did church. They didn't keep the Jewish Torah. They didn't keep the Jewish festivals. I mean, imagine this. You grew up your entire life eating kosher. You know the Torah inside and out. These people think Habakkuk is something that gives you cancer. You've spent your whole life celebrating the holy feasts and the holy days. Now they just want to worship with Chris Tomlin songs. Can you imagine? This is the church Paul is writing to. They're racially divided. They're divided in so many different ways, and they're using spiritual language to cloak their human division. And here's what Paul says in Romans 14. I'm going to sum it up for what Ben just read, the few basic principles. He says, learn to differentiate between areas of conviction and areas of command. Don't make your preferences. Don't force that on somebody else as your convictions. Your area of preference is not a stumbling block. That's what he's saying. Don't major on minor doctrines. Withhold judgment where the gospel is not threatened. Exercise your convictions to build others up, not to tear them down. Do not exchange freedom in Christ for slavery to human traditions. And at all times, act in love and carry each other's burdens. In Romans 14, basically what you could say is that Paul is saying God is the God of the weak and the strong. He's the God of the weak, the teetotal and vegan Jews who insist on keeping the Sabbath, and He's the God of the strong, the wine-sipping, Saturday shopping, bacon-munching Gentiles. And Paul is saying, if God has justified you, you cannot condemn them. Because, and this is a huge thing, look at what it all leads up to in Romans chapter 15. Here's what Paul says. We who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak, not to please ourselves. Each of us should please our neighbor for their good, to build them up. For even Christ did not please Himself. And then skip on down to verse 5. May the God who gives endurance and encouragement give you the same attitude of mind towards each other that Jesus Christ had, so that with one mind and one voice you may glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Accept one another then, just as, let's read this together, as Christ accepted you, in order to bring praise to God. Accept one another because Jesus has accepted you. That means accept each other's opinions, preferences, and styles, not as something you have to make your own, but as something you can respect as a generational difference, not a gospel truth. That's the point of Romans. That's actually the point of the New Testament. Don't make debatable matters the center of the story of Jesus, because it's not. How we work these things out is not worship wars. That shows us how the way that we framed it with worship wars shows us how individual and consumeristic we have. This is the heart of the Christian faith. It is the heart of the gospel according to Paul. You want to know how the Old Testament ends? For 400 years, they're not going to have another word from God. 400 years. This is how the Old Testament ends in Malachi. See, I will send the prophet Elijah before you on that great and dreadful day when the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of their children to their parents. Well, isn't that natural? Shouldn't their hearts be turned towards each other already? But he's getting at this idea because it's really hard. It always has been to pass on the gospel from generation to generation. And then the Gospel of Luke, which we've been in for the last few months, it begins with Elijah, John the Baptist, and it describes John the Baptist like this. He will bring back the Lord, many of the people of Israel will he bring back to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers toward their children. Later on, Luke is going to write in his sequel in the book of Acts, he's going to describe King David. And he's going to say, King David had served God's purposes in his own generation, and when he did that, he fell asleep. Can I tell you that's what you really want? What you really want isn't just for them always to sing your favorite songs in church. What you really want is not to get our way versus them get their way. No, come on. That's too small of a thing to give our lives and attention to. What every one of us wants is that. to be faithful to God in our own generation. And can I tell you, when this happens, I've seen it plenty, it's beautiful. I've seen plenty of senior saints gathered around, with people gathered around their hospital bed from all 5 generations because they got this, because they made Jesus the main thing. We all want to be a part of passing the gospel off from generations to generations. May we keep Jesus the center of the gospel that we preach. May we be generous to our kids and our grandkids. May we be generous to our parents and our grandparents as we pass the gospel off from generation to generation. I'd like to invite the shepherds to take their places in the aisles. These are godly guys. If you've had something going on this week, or maybe you've got something coming up this next week, or maybe there's a spirit of anxiety in you this past week, or you just like to share or celebrate something that happened good, these guys would love to pray and bless you. If you're here today and you would like to put Jesus on in baptism, you'd like to turn over and start a new chapter and a new story of your life, we would love to help you do that. I'll be right down here. You can come while together we stand and worship the God of every generation.